Tilea's Troubles, Part 70. Prequel to the second assault upon Viadaza. Summer 2403. Excerpt from The Holiest of Armies, A History of the Disciplinati di Morr. As spring came to a close in the year 2403, it seemed inevitable that bloody civil war would engulf the city-state of Remas. Despite the threats presented by both Razga's brutes and the vampire duchess's foul armies. Two factions vied to wrest complete control of the realm. Father Caradalio now ruled the city and eastern district of Palamtrina with an iron rod. The noble houses were powerless. Overlord Matuzi held hostage, the streets, and indeed the very houses, patrolled and policed by his fanatical dedicants. But he did not rule the entire realm, for the new Archlector, Bernardo, and the veteran army of Remas held the southwestern district of Frascotti. Duke Guidobaldo of Pavona had apparently busied himself with brokering a peace between the Reman factions, but his efforts proved to be of no avail, for eventually the Reman army left its fortified camp and marched aggressively upon the city, intending that their erstwhile allies, the Pavonans, would join them in their enterprise. Rumours were rife. Were one to give equal countenance to all that was said, it seemed each and every party intended to harm each and every other, and that not one single honest agreement had been made. It was claimed that every lord and priest plotted assassinations and treachery, so that each in return was the target of the same. The factions were divided even within themselves, with several Reman soldiers being secret Morrite dedicants, while some of the Disciplinati inwardly yearned for the return of the church proper and secular authority. Although the Reman army now advanced against the city, its walls manned by Disciplinati defenders, some said both sides had secretly agreed to turn upon the Pavonans, while others claimed that the Pavonans had sided with both factions, leaving their true intentions a mystery, but treacherous either way. The truth will never be known, for even those who plotted could not be certain of others' minds, and perhaps had not even decided what they themselves would really do when push came to shove. The outcome balanced upon a knife's edge, and everyone had a well-honed blade to hand. Yet out of all this suspicion and turmoil, just as everything seemed to be coming to a head, an agreement was reached, as unexpected as it was sudden. The Praepositus Generalis of the Disciplinati di Morr, Father Caradalio, accepted the terms offered by the Archlector Bernardo Ugolini, and both sides, despite suspicions and distrust, remained true to their promises. War was averted. Duke Guidobaldo and his ragged army of Pavonans slunk away, perhaps simply to remove himself from all repercussions arising from any exposure of his duplicity, while the two most holy Morrite clergy in Tilea, one the radical, fanatical leader of the Low Church, the other the official noble ruler of the High Church, embraced each other as dear friends. All in the city wondered at Morr's power, for it seemed only divine will could have healed such a scission. Father Caradalio knelt before the holy pontiff, humbly confessed his sins, and professed obedience to the Church of Morr. In return, he was not only granted forgiveness, but praised for his steadfast obedience to Morr's revealed will, and given command of the now officially recognised Disciplinati di Morr. At Urbino, the Archlector had personally witnessed what such fanatical dedicants were capable of in battle, how they alone could be relied on to stand and fight to a man, even in the face of all the terrors the vampire's armies possessed, and, it turned out, even in the face of certain defeat. He now commanded them to march forthwith from the city to seek battle with the foe. If it were not divine will that had salved Remas's wounds, then perhaps Father Caradalio simply accepted that to attempt to hold the city against the Reman army, the anointed father of the church and the will of the majority of citizens, would prove disastrous. Why allow such turmoil when all he wanted was to serve the great god Morr in the war against the undead, and all he had ever done, all he had ever preached, if with a hard heart, was pursuit of that goal. As for the Archlector, a man experienced in politics, who had himself faced the undead in battle, perhaps he too saw the folly of engaging in a war that would weaken both the army under his command and the very fanatics best suited to fight against the true and terrible enemy. They both knew this was a time for war, but not civil war. Their common enemy threatened a fate much worse than that they presented to each other, a threat so great it made any disagreements between them seem trivial, despite having caused such turmoil and suffering. No time was wasted. The Disciplinati di Morr being ever ready for any command, driven by their fanatical desire to prove themselves with every thought and action as the perfect servants of Morr, the agents of his righteous vengeance and anger, his very weapons. Of course, the Archlector and the citizens were keen to see them go, for no city could endure their fervent scrutiny for long, nor could it truly thrive while subject to their attentions. Within 2 days, the holiest of armies departed and began its march to Urbino. There they met with an order of Morrite dedicants of almost exactly like minds, whom they happily incorporated into the army, thus swelling to an even greater strength. They parted Urbino only a day later, such was their keenness to face the foe. Besides, Father Carradalio knew full well that to tarry even a little while could bring disaster to such an army, its warriors filled to the brim with a lust for battle, barely able to contain a frenzied fury which made them want to scourge their own flesh to the very bone. They aimed to cross the river Trantino to the south of Viadaza, for they had not the patience to go by way of the bridge at Scorsio. Father Carradalio led the army, his admonitor, Brother Vincenzo, by his side. He refused any mount or carriage, and would have only the scouts ahead of him, being too fearless to demand his bodyguard stay ever close, but too wise to forgo the necessity of scouts to a marching army. Besides, the army itself was his bodyguard. Should any enemy have approached, they would have found themselves overwhelmed by a great swarm of dedicants, ecstatically happy to martyr themselves in the defence of such an instrument of holy Morr as he. Morr himself visited Carradalio's dreams to reveal the enemy's whereabouts. Carradalio thus announced to his lieutenants that 2 cities now contained the enemy's armies, Viadaza and Trantio. The Disciplinati, he commanded, would take Viadaza, for it had so long threatened Urbino, and was a port through which the vampires could channel the reinforcements elsewhere. Besides, he declared, the men to the south should and could face the other army, while he and the Disciplinati would strike at the vampires' very hearts, for once they had captured Adolfo's city of Viadaza, they could strike at Maria's city of Urbino, and finally the foul origin of the corruption, Miragliano. Carradalio marched with sword drawn, not just leading the column, but also leading them in chanted prayers. The prayers maintained the army's fervour, lending them a strength which belied the meagre rations of the past days and weeks, for the words had sufficient power in them to stir the winds of magic. Occasionally they burst into hymns, which lifted the dedicant spirits just as a marching song might do in any army. These encouragements were bolstered further by the prayers being offered by the many priests and monks accompanying the army. Each body of dedicants had spiritual guides, either rectors assigned to them by Father Carradalio, or the shepherd marshals who had first guided them in their dedication to Morr, or both. Furthermore, there was barely a settlement of any size they passed that had not sent out a knot of priests to witness the army, channeling the encouraging will of Morr to wash down upon his warriors. Marching immediately behind the Praepositus Generalis were a company of Reman citizen dedicants. These were the men who had seized the city upon Father Carradalio's command, tearing through the streets to slay any hired bravi or nobleman's servant who stood in their way. Wholly obedient, they questioned no order, not even in their own hearts or minds, for they believed that their God spoke through Carradalio, that his words were divine in origin. Their robes still carried the bloodstains from that struggle, as well as that of their own blood, born of the scars of their flagellations. Behind them marched the dedicants of Palamtrina, who had been even more brutal than their Reman counterparts in purging their own villages. Indeed, they had gone too far, for in their fury many innocents had died, and so their self-proclaimed prophet had been executed and they had been admonished. Yet these events had served to strengthen their resolve to serve Morr in body and soul, and they were imbued with not one iota's less fervour than the rest of the army. Next came Caradalio's torch-bearing bodyguard, always ensuring that at least 3 carried flames, that they might be ready in but a moment to light the other torches. There was magic woven into the flames, so that they shone with a light both natural and otherworldly, capable of burning even creatures of the ether. Then came the tolling bell upon its carriage. This was cousin to that which had been lost on the field at Urbino, and it sang with almost exactly the same sombre tone. Sacred texts adorned its mount, bearing the words that its accompanying guards quietly chanted over and over. Behind the bell marched more Reman dedicants, made up of those foreigners who had travelled from all over the old world to live in the Holy City. They carried enormous, heavy, viciously barbed flails of iron, capable of killing a man merely by falling upon him, which they swung in hard-learned and painfully practised motions. A much greater number had left Remas, and still more fell daily as a consequence of the slightest misstep or one moment's bad timing. Yet still they continued, for such was their dedication to martyrdom that they no longer cared for anything but their holy, wild and deadly cavortings. It was such as these who convinced Caradalio of the need to reach the foe as quickly as possible. To linger even a day too long could critically sap his army's strength. As he famously said to the Archlector during his public profession of his sins, in explanation of the Disciplinati's hasty and violent seizure of the city, "The fuse has been lit, and we needs must place the charge before it bursts." To which the Archlector had graciously agreed that it would be a terrible waste to be hoist by one's own petard. Next in the column trundled Maestro Angelo da Leone's engine of war, his Cannone Luminoso, with its impressive array of giant lenses. By now it had become common knowledge in the city that this machine had been abandoned by the Maestro when he instead had chosen to work on his steam engine for the Archlector Callictus II. Yet it was also known that the lenses had since been proven effective enough to melt several men, and that Da Leone had declared with confidence that the piercing light it admitted would burn the undead even more readily than the living. Father Caradalio hoped it would wash its rays against Viadaza's parapets, scorching the foul flesh of whatever stood there. But although he had prayed for guidance upon how best to employ such an engine, Morr ignored his requests. Then came the most recent recruits to the Holy Army, the dedicants of Urbino. They, like the Palamtrinans, had gone to great and terrible lengths to cleanse their settlement of sin. In fact, they had gone much further, for they had not just run violently through the streets in a riot of religiously inspired hatred, fighting any opposition, but had calmly gathered up all those they considered guilty of even the most minor of crimes, including those merely suspected of such, even on the flimsiest of evidence, and put them to death. This they did to be certain of an effective purging, even if it was at the cost of the death of many innocents, even members of their own family. They had executed them publicly, one after the other, and in the grisliest of ways, by burnings and beheadings, or combinations thereof. They believed the suffering not only cleansed the guilty victims' souls, but ensured Morr would pour his righteous blessing upon the whole of Urbino, especially the dedicants who proved themselves so thoroughly committed that they could punish even their own neighbours and family. Amongst their number were grey-robed monks from the Morrite monastery Sacra di San Antamo, on the rocky promontory to the northwest of Urbino. The rest, being the bulk of their number, were still garbed in their peasant clothes, albeit favouring the Morrite hues of grey and red. Marching behind the Urbiman dedicants was a substantial number of soldiers. Barone Pietro of Urbino had brought the single small company of Compagnia del Sole crossbowmen left behind as a token act of mercy when all the rest of the mercenaries marched away, leaving the Urbimans unprotected in this time of need. He and his household guard of light horsemen, however, were acting as scouts, with the aforementioned blessing of Father Caradalio. Of course, many more of the Barone's subjects were part of the Holy Army, but he recognised that as Morrite dedicants, any authority he had over them was little more than nominal. They had been willingly absorbed into the Disciplinati di Morr, and were now Caradalio's to command. Not that the Barone cared overmuch, for he too shared enough fear to make him almost as much a Morrite cultist as them. There was also the standing guard of the city of Remas, known as the Palace Guard, consisting almost entirely of mercenaries from the Northern Empire, commanded by Captain Vogel. Their presence was something of an act of penance, for Vogel had not only failed to lift a finger to halt the Disciplinatis' uprising and seizure of the city, but was known to have secretly agreed with Caradalio not to interfere beyond ensuring the personal safety of the highest clergymen. In return, he had been promised the reward of becoming commander of the city's entire regular forces and a doubling in the size of his company, along with a proportionate increase in his pay. The Archlector had decided he could hardly forgive Father Caradalio his sins and not Captain Vogel, nor did he want to dismiss and disperse a body of soldiers, such as the Guard, in a time of war. So, they too were forgiven, then ordered to accompany the Holy Army upon the march to face the Vampire Duchess's armies, thus removing such untrustworthy soldiers from the city. Their main company, men-at-arms carrying either halberds or greatswords, marched immediately behind the Campagna's crossbowmen, whilst at their rear came their own crossbowmen, as well as the army's artillery, Vogel's brace of cannons. Captain Vogel had voiced his little confidence in the Maestro's war machine, resurrected as it was from the scrap heap, hoping instead his own pets, his pocket pistols as he liked to call them, would do what was required to punch some real holes in the enemy's defences. This was the force that marched to Viadaza to face an army of the dead.